Okay. Okay, today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Kaf. We're continuing on in our Rabbi Shimon Rabbana Machloket about Ish Tachiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, and then we're going to get off into a new Mishnah and other topics. So we finished off the daf with this Rav Menashe Bar Zvid comes along. Okay, maybe we'll do a brief review, and I put a chart at the top of the sheet about the Machloket between Rav Oshaya and Rav Papa about Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, which you can kind of review, which is basically Rabbi Shimon holds, again, generally we say if a woman's married to her husband dies childless, she falls to Yibum to whatever brothers are alive at the time. And she can't fall to Yibum to anyone who wasn't alive when he died. That's Ish Tachiv Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. And that's because it says, Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav. The whole Yibum parsha starts off with when brothers sit together. That means they had to have been alive at the same time. According to the rabbis, once this brother, let's call him Levi, was born after Reuven died, she's never going to be permitted to him. The whole Eshet Ach that we permit because of Yibum, which is normally Ereva, right? You can't normally marry your brother's wife, is going to be overridden in general for Yibum, but never in this case. If he wasn't alive in the time of the brother, Yibum doesn't apply. It will never apply. It doesn't matter how many other brothers of his she marries and who all die childless, she will never be able to marry Levi. Do Yibum with him, right? Obviously never marry him. Only Yibum would be allowed. But again, Yibum is a type of marriage. But Rabbi Shimon disagrees. And Rabbi Shimon says, and his whole logic, and we saw this at the end of yesterday's daf and also before that, which is, since he was born to her, and as he was born, Levi was born in a time when she was already disconnected from Reuven and connected to Shimon. Now, we talked about two different possibilities, Rabbi Oshaya or Rav Papa, whether as soon as Reuven dies, she's already linked to Shimon because Zika, or maybe only once she does Yibum with Shimon, okay, whichever way we go, which is really the general way we go, is the second option, which is only if she already did Yibum with Shimon. Since when Levi was born, she was married to Shimon, so she's already considered like Shimon's wife. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon says, sorry for the confusion of Rabbi Shimon and Shimon, but Rabbi Shimon holds that she's okay. You can almost remember it this way because Rabbi Shimon holds Shimon is, right? It's all viewed through the prism of Shimon. So when Shimon dies, we don't really care about Yibum, what happened the first time. The Eshet Ach becomes permitted because as soon as Shimon dies, his brother, who he was alive with at the time, can do Yibum with her, no problem. So Rav Menashe Bar Zvid sat in front of Rav Huna at the end of yesterday's daf and said, what's the reason for Rabbi Shimon? And the Gemara says, what are you talking about? What's the reason for Rabbi Shimon? We already know the reason for Rabbi Shimon. He said it explicitly. So then he says, oh no, what he must have meant, the Gemara fixes his question and said what Rav Menashe must have really meant was, my Tamid Rabbana. What's the reason for the rabbi's opinion? And then we said, what's the reason? Because it says, Ulekachalo li'isha v'yibma. That's in the Yibum Psukim. It says he takes him for a wife, and he does Yibum with her. Now, after he takes her for a wife, she's already married to him. Why does it say v'yibma? That word is unnecessary. They use a word with the Yibum root in it to say she still got the Yibum of her first husband upon her. Even when she marries Shimon, she still has this connection to Reuven, in which case she can never marry his brother that wasn't alive at the time that he died. So then they say, okay, wait, and we only started the question, we kind of ended mid-question, which is, Elaha ditnanim, now at the last line of Yud Terem Beth. The fact that it says in the Mishnah, Knasa harei ki ishto l'chol davar. Once he does Yibum with her, Shimon does Yibum with Reuven's wife, she is like his wife for all intents and purposes. But Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, what does this mean? So Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina explained that this means, Milamed shemigalsha beget. If he wants to divorce her, he can divorce her with a get, meaning she doesn't need chalitza from him. Okay, you might have thought maybe she needs to do Yibum with him, and therefore if he wants to get rid of her, divorce her, whatever, not a nice word I use, but he wants to divorce her, so he would have to maybe also need chalitza. Maybe get's not enough, maybe also chalitza, because if she still has Yibumim arishonim aleha, right, then maybe to disconnect, she needs to disconnect with chalitza. But here comes Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, he says, no, he divorces her with a get, and not only that, fascinating halacha, machzira. If he divorces her, he can even remarry her. Again, this obviously means not if she married someone else in the interim. We've already learned you can't ever do that. But the point is, even though you might think he's marrying his brother's wife, right? That's forbidden. It's only permitted because of Yibum. Once he fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum, maybe he can't marry her again if he divorces her. Comes the halach and says, no. With him, the Eshet Ach is gone, basically. Okay? So she's basically his wife at this point. So now they say, Hatam Nami, Lema, why didn't you say the same thing here? V'yibma, adayin yibumim arishonim alav v'tibai chalitza. Really, it's two questions. In fact, there's different versions what the question is. Is the issue here that it's chalitza, that she would at least need chalitza if she's still considered Reuven's widow, then she needs to do chalitza to get out of the marriage with Shimon. Or also maybe she can't remarry him because she's still got Yibum of Reuven and she did the Yibum and therefore she shouldn't be allowed anymore. So in any case, these questions are drasha v'yibma. We're going to have this structure of what's going to happen here, which is there's one pasuk which says v'yibma, she's still got Yibum upon her. But here, she's considered really Shimon's full-fledged wife for all intents and purposes and no longer connected to Reuven because of a different drasha. Because it says, and he takes her for a wife, which was the first part of that phrase, right? V'yibma tells you she's still got some yibum from Reuven. Lekachalo lisha means she's his full-fledged wife. So obviously there's a little arbitrary, right? Why add that one and take away that one, right? Why are we basically splitting? And that's going to be a structure we're going to see again in today's Daf, which is, right, where there's one part of the verse, which is including something, one part, which is not including something. So kevan ihachi hachanami. If you're going to say she's ki'ishto l'chol davar, then we should say that she doesn't have the Yibum of Reuven on her anymore. Right? This is kind of either go with this or go with that. How can you go with both? So they say the obvious answer, which is, right, we've had this many times where, well, one word is coming to say Yibma, she's still got Yibum. The other words, the Kachalu Lisha, means she's a full-fledged wife. So when it comes to the get and the right, that we're going to view her, she doesn't need chalitza. But when it comes to the issue of Esh Tachiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo, we're still going to consider her Reuven's, right? Reuven's Yevamot, in which case she can never marry Levi, who was born after Reuven died. So then the Gemara is going to ask the obvious, which is Mara'ita. Why did we, it's almost arbitrary. Why did we say that's the one we're going to say for this issue, she still is connected to Reuven. For the other issue, she's not connected to Reuven at all. So mistabra shte hetera ahetera ushte isura aisura. When it comes to the Isur of Eshet Ach, there's an Isur of Eshet Ach. We allow it because of Yibum, but Esh Tachiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo was forbidden, so we're going to keep that forbidden. When it comes to hetera, in other words, allowing her to be divorced with a get, so that we're going to keep within the hetera. Okay, that like the issue of get generally permits a woman. So we're going to keep that as that one works. But when it comes to Esh Tachiv Shelo Haya B'Olamo, because that was forbidden, we're going to keep that forbidden. Okay, so therefore, that's their answer. It's not as random as you thought. And now we're going to move on to a question on Rabbi Shimon. So that was all a question on the rabbis' reasoning. Now we're going to ask a kind of bit of a bizarre question, I'll have to agree, on Rabbi Shimon, because they're kind of creating a case that will create an absurd question. And the Gemara is going to kind of ask, that's a bit of an absurd question, but we'll see. So the Rabbi Shimon de Amar, ho'ilu mitza'ah behetel, v'lo amda alav sha'a achat be'isur, if his whole theory is that when Levi was born, she was married to Shimon, and it was perfectly legitimate for her to be married to Shimon. And now that Levi is born under Shimon's, marriage to her, then Shimon and Levi are achim that were together, and therefore if Shimon were to die, she can basically do Yibum to Levi. So the whole logic is, since Shimon married her fair and square, and Levi was born fair and square when she was married to Shimon, so we're going to view this all through the Shimon lens. So now they say, Elame'ata, what about this case? Okay, and I'm going to put the case up. It's a little bit strange the way the case is told to us, because the case is told to us in a way that we don't really understand the case. Like, they're going to talk about something that doesn't really make any, like, you'll have to see as it goes on, okay, how this works. 1 second. Okay, so now, here's our case. Achoto me'imo. Okay, we don't have a sister yet in the picture, so just wait for that part. Okay, we're going to have someone who's a sister through the mother, but we're not there yet. It's only going to be described as we go on. Usually the cases start and they already describe and you get it from the beginning. This is kind of explaining something from the end of the story at the beginning. So just wait. So before this sister from the mother was born, Nisa'a achiv me aviv. Okay, we're going to have this woman, Dina, who's going to marry Reuven. Okay, so basically we have two separate marriages, two separate children. They have no connection to each other whatsoever. So Reuven marries Dina. Okay, an average marriage, two people who have no connection to each other. Now what happens? Well, Dina's father either dies or divorces his wife. Okay, this is not going to be a Yibum situation yet. So he just isn't married anymore to her mother, and her mother marries Reuven's father. Okay, so basically the couple that are married to each other, their parents end up getting married. Okay, that's pretty simple so far. Then what happens? That new couple, right? So again, you have they're married and they're married. Okay, now that couple has a child. Okay, that new couple who's basically the father of the groom and the I'm just calling the bride and groom, but the married couple. Okay, so the father of the husband and the mother of the wife have a child. So now let's go back and read it from the beginning. Achoto me'imo. So Shimon, this new child, is right. Dina is his sister from his mother, and Reuven is his brother from his father. So his half brother is married to his half sister. Okay, that's the easy way to say it. Okay, so achatomi emotion is aviv achiv me'aviv, right? So first, again, before he was born, and this is where we're going to go because it was all happened. They weren't connected before he was born. Only when he's born is there some connection here. Char kach nolad ach, and then what happened? Umet, Reuven dies. Now what's going to happen? Dina is going to fall to Yibum to Shimon, right? And basically the Gemara is going to say, Tityabim, she should do Yibum. Why? Ho'il ubao mitza'a behetel. Because when Shimon was born, this couple was totally legit, fair and square. They were allowed to be married to each other, right? And Shimon wasn't even there. Now that Shimon comes into the picture, now again, it's not a fair comparison. But what they're saying is this would be absurd. She obviously can't do Yibum to Shimon because they're siblings, they're halves, right? It's her half sister through his mother. So there's no way he could possibly do that. But if you say Ho'il umitza'a behetel, right? Meaning Dina and Reuven had a perfectly good marriage. They weren't related in any way, shape, or form before Shimon was born. So maybe you would think that you could say the same thing. Now, it's not a fair comparison. It's not exactly the same thing, but right now they're going to kind of suggest that maybe it is the same thing. Okay, so it's a bit of a weird question, to which the Gemara says, how can you just ignore, like you're suggesting that this would work? Of course this can't work. It's his sister. Of course, he can't marry his sister. You can't just throw his sister's arayot out the window. So they retort back. Rabbi Shimon is throwing an erva out the window because what's he saying? He's saying when she was married to Reuven, remember our basic case, and then Levi was born after Reuven died. That's erva. That brother is eshet ach. That's not permitted because of Yibum, and he should be forbidden forever. And Rabbi Shimon overrides that. So why wouldn't he theoretically override this? Which again is tried to say, of course, that would never override. But the logic would say your logic is going to take us to crazy places. That's what he's basically saying. So the Gemara says, no. Isur eshet achiv is not the same as isur achoto. Why? Eshet achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. This little brother being born is not the same thing. Why? The issue of the sister will never be overridden. Why? Because hayisur delele hatera. There's never permission for someone to marry his sister. Never. Right? There's no case where we're going to permit that. But hayisur delele hatera. But a brother, generally, eshet ach is always overridden for Yibum. So while it's true that it was eshet achiv shelo haya ba'olamo for Reuven, again, Rabbi Shimon goes back to his approach, which is eshet achiv could be overridden. Sometimes I'm going to override it here as well. Because again, as relates to Shimon, it's an eshet achiv shehaya ba'olamo. He was alive and therefore not. So they kind of took his logic and tried to say it's ridiculous because you come to these ridiculous conclusions, to which he said, you're comparing two different things. It's not a fair comparison. A sister is not the same as your brother's wife because your brother's wife is generally overridden for Yibum. So I'll extend it to eshet achiv shelo haya ba'olamo in a case where the brother was alive when the second brother was married, in which case now that the second brother died, we go according to that and we don't look backwards at what happened with Reuven, and that I'm willing to be matir. I would never permit, obviously, a sister. Next Mishnah. This Mishnah is going to a little bit go back and then go forward. Klal amru b'Yevamot. Okay, there was a general principle they said about Yevamot, and this is kind of a review in one line of what we learned so far. Kol Shiur, right, if you can sum up 20 pages of Yevamot or 18 pages of Yevamot like this, Kol shehi isur erva lo choletzet v'lo mityabemet. Any situation where there's erva, right, by Torah law, she doesn't do yibum and she doesn't even need chalitza, right? She's permitted, her tzara, her second wife is permitted, right? There is no yibum or chalitza. But category number 2, we're going to have 3 categories. One is going to be no chalitza, no yibum. The next is going to be, we make you do chalitza, but you can't do yibum. And the third category is going to be, you can either do yibum or chalitza. So the second category is called isur mitzvah v'isur kedusha. Okay, I don't even know how to translate it, but something forbidden that's a mitzvah, something forbidden that's kedusha. We don't yet know what this means. We're going to leave it for another minute. I'm going to leave you in suspense, but one more minute we'll explain because the Mishnah is going to explain itself. In these cases, if it's forbidden because of a mitzvah or forbidden because of kedusha, because of sanctity, then she does chalitza and not yibum. Achota shehi yivimta choletzet o mityabemet. Okay, let's go back now to our charts. What is achota shehi yivimta? We actually had this case in the end of Yud Chen Mabet. We have 3 brothers here, and this is just an example, okay? Levi has a son called Amram, okay? And then there's Leah and Rachel who are sisters. So we have 3 brothers, 3 sisters, and one brother has a son. One of the sisters marries the son, okay? Then they get divorced or he dies or something happens. They're not married anymore. And then she decides to marry her husband, her previous husband's uncle, which is fine. That's not a problem. She can't marry a son and his father, right? That's kalato. The father can't marry the daughter-in-law, but she could marry his uncle if she wants. So she marries his uncle, and then the other sister marries the other uncle, Shimon. So we have Leah married to Reuven and Rachel married to Shimon. So 2 sisters married to 2 brothers. And then what happens? Both brothers die. This is a case we've seen where the achayot become Yevamot, right? They're both going to fall to Yibum Yada Levi. What have we said in the past? There's Zika, right? Levi now is supposed to marry 2 sisters. He can't. So, and it's called achot zekukato. He's supposed to marry the sister of the woman he's already got a Yibum, relationship to. He can't marry any one of them. But what we're going to see now is sorry, my thing is blocking. You probably see it. Okay. So here, let's just go back. Leah now, the issue is like this. They both fall to Levi, so theoretically it should be a problem. However, Leah can't marry Levi. There's no Zika between Levi and Leah because Leah is Levi's daughter-in-law, okay? Even though she's not now, but she was at some point, and that erva remains. So he can never marry anyone his son was married to. So since Leah is prohibited to do Yibum with Levi, Rachel becomes permitted. So even though normally 2 sisters fall to Yibum to the same brothers, they can't do Yibum. In this case, so again, let's read it inside. Achota sheyivimta choletzet o mityabemet. So she is allowed to do Yibum. Okay? That's basically the situation. So now what we want to, so again, we had first category, can't do Yibum or Chalitza. That's Ereva. That's all the things we learned before. And therefore, she can go get married to anyone she wants right away. Second is this Isur Mitzvah, Isur Kedusha, which we're going to explain in a second, where you do Chalitza but not Yibum. And the third is where there could be a case with Achota Sheyivimta where she could do Yibum or Chalitza. And that's the case we just explained. Isur Mitzvah, what is this? The Mishnah continues. Shniyot midivrei sofrim. This we're going to get to tomorrow, all the details. All sorts of rabbinic arayot, meaning it's not forbidden by Torah law, but it's forbidden by rabbinic law. Now you understand why you do Chalitza and Yibum, because on a Torah level, you can actually do Yibum because it's not a forbidden relationship. But on a rabbinic level, you can't marry them because it's forbidden on a rabbinic level. So instead of Yibum, you do Chalitza. Second category, Isur Kedusha. Almana lekohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza lekohen ediot, mamzeret u'nitina liYisrael u'bat Yisrael lenatinu lamamzer. This category is what we call Isur Lav. These are things that are forbidden on a Torah law. They're not like the previous category, which was only rabbinic. They're forbidden by Torah law, but only a lo taseh. You can't marry them because it's a lo taseh, but there's no karet, there's no court-imposed death penalty. It's a more lenient, okay? This is a widow to a high priest, a divorcee, or someone who did chalitza with the Kohen Gadol. There's also other people like a zonah and other things. A mamzer, okay? Mamzerim can't marry each other. So if either a mamzeret fell to yibum to a regular person, or a woman fell to yibum to a man who is a mamzer, then, or a natin. What's a natin? These were the people, they were called the Givonim in the time of Yoshua, and they faked out Yoshua. They pretended their clothes were old and all this, and they ended up, Yoshua made a brit with them, even though he wasn't supposed to, and then he ended up, they ended up being our water, they drew the water for us and things like that, and they ended up converting, but they made a gzera. They're called netinim because it says vayitnem. He put them to become our water collectors, etc. So because of that, they're called nitinim from the word vayitnem, and they're not allowed to marry into the community. Okay, so these people can't marry in. So what if you fall to yibum to one of them, or you're one of these people who falls to yibum to a regular Yisrael? So in all these cases, it's an isur lav. Okay, it's a lo taseh to get married to them. So in this case, we basically say choletzet v'lo mityabem, right? She does chalitza because there is a mitzvah of yibum, just you can't do it through marriage because it's forbidden to marry them. Okay, we're going to get to why specifically they are obligated in yibum. So klala tuyemai. First, the Gemara starts off with this first word, which you probably didn't really pay attention to, which is klal amru b'yevamah. There was a general rule they said about a yevamah. We're now going to have we're going to have the sugya in parallel, two different versions, and they're going to actually come to opposite conclusions about a derivation they're making from the first line of the Mishnah. So the first version is that what's the word klal coming to include? La tuyemai, it must be coming to include something additional. Amar from Bar Papa, la tuyet sarat ailonit. It's to tell you not only arayot, but even the tzara of an ailonit, of a woman who can't have children. Remember this woman who's in a specific category of a woman who can't have children. She has no signs of puberty, never anything. Uchi de Rav Asi. And according to Rav Asi, that basically her tzara, even though she's not Ereva, it wasn't forbidden for her to marry her husband. It's not forbidden for her to marry another person, but there's no yibum for her because she can't have children. And the whole idea is to have children. So therefore, right, the whole idea of yibum is to hakim et shem hamet. So therefore, her tzara is basically doesn't need chalitza either. Just like the Ereva, it's to include an additional case. And that's like Rav Asi. Some people say, Kol she'isura isur erva, which is a quote from the Mishnah, although you'll see it's not a direct quote from the Mishnah. If you see in the Mishnah itself, if you have a regular Gemara in front of you, there's a little aleph by the words Kol she'isur erva. Clearly, there was a different version of the Mishnah, which read like this: Kol she'isura isur erva. Okay, which is very similar. It's just different words a little bit. But anytime where her isur is erva, huda asira tzarata. That's when her tzara doesn't need yibum either. But halo asira is sorava. This comes to exclude. If it's not erva, it's only one whose isur is erva. They're ignoring the word klal. They're saying we're going to learn it from here. Only if it's erva does she exclude the tzara, which means what? The opposite. From here you can learn tzarat ailonid, right? So halo asira is sorava, tzarat halo asira. Lemu'utemai, what does this come to exclude? Amara from the Mu'ute Tzarat Ailonit Udiltalo Rav Asi. So according to this version, it comes to say our mission doesn't hold like Rav Asi because it's only Erva and nothing that's not Erva. So the Tzarav and Ailonit would actually have to do Chalitza or Yibum, right? She would be obligated, as opposed to the first way of reading it, which was to include that case. Today is a lot of including, excluding. Which one do we include? Which one do we exclude? A lot of this back and forth. Going now to the Achotah She'ivim Takes. Achotah deman, sister of what kind of erva are we talking about here? Ilema di isur mitzvah. If you want to say, remember what happens? Since the sister can't marry the brother, the other sister is allowed to do yibum. So if you say this sister, in what way is she forbidden isur mitzvah? Maybe it's only on a rabbinic level. Well, kevan demitoraita ram yakameh pagaba achot zchukato. Since if it was only erva b'derabbanan, not like the case we saw was his daughter-in-law, that's midoraita, Torah law. But let's say it was only rabbinic law she was forbidden. That would mean, again, when you have rabbinic law, you have to view things also from a purely Torah level. On a purely Torah level, she would have to do yibum because she's not forbidden whatsoever. So if that's the case, pagaba achot zekukato, on a Torah level, he's actually now supposed to marry two sisters. Only because the rabbis came in is one dropout. But on a Torah level, he's supposed to marry both. And then he should basically not be able to do Yibum with either one of them. Ela achotad isor erva. And therefore, it must be, we're talking about only the Torah law ervas with a sister. Isor mitzvot shniot. So now they say, okay, wait. Amai karele isor mitzvah. We now want to know first, okay, we're going to do two things here. One is, where do we get from the word isor mitzvah that means Dirabanan, right? Or arayot Dirabanan. And how do we know Isur Kedusha means Isurei Lo Taseh? Okay, that's the first thing we're going to do. And then we're going to bring a different version, which flips the definitions. Rabbi Yehuda thinks that Isur Mitzvah is Lo Taseh, negative ones, and Isur Kedusha is the rabbinic arayot. Okay, so we're going to have a flip, and then we're going to have to explain his logic. Like, where do they get it from the words? So again, let's look inside. Isur mitzvah shniot. Amai karele isur mitzvah. Am rabbayim mitzvah l'shma l'divrei chachamim. Anything rabbinic, it's a mitzvah to listen to the rabbis. So we'll call it isur mitzvah, which means, right, it's isurim that are a mitzvah because they're a mitzvah to keep them because the rabbi said it, and it's a mitzvah to keep what the rabbi said. Isur kedusha amana l'kohen gadol grusha l'chalutza l'kohen idiot. Amai karelehu isur kedusha. Dichtiv kedoshim yu le'elohim. Because it says in the psukim about the Kohanim, you're supposed to be sanctified to your God. And then it says, don't marry this one, don't marry that one, don't marry that one. So there you see this juxtaposition between Kedusha and not marrying people. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda machlif. But according to the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda flips. Okay, he says, Isur mitzvah, amana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen idiot. Why does he call this amai karele Isur mitzvah? Dichtiv ela mitzvot. In that section, it also says, right at the end of the section, it says, Elam mitzvot. This is actually at the end, toward the end of Sefer Vayikra. It says, these are the mitzvot, which were all these sorts of mitzvot that related to Kohanim, and it relates to a whole bunch of things. These are the mitzvot that God commanded at Har Sinai. And from there, they say, that refers to this. They're called mitzvot. Isur kedusha, shniyot midivrei sofrim, amai karele isur kedusha. Amar Abaye, kol ha'mekayem divrei chachamim nikra kadosh. Abaye says, anyone who keeps the words of the rabbi is called sanctified. Now, the word sanctified is not exactly the opposite of, right, someone who does a mitzvah and the opposite of someone who doesn't keep a mitzvah. But sanctified sounds like you're above the law almost, right? It sounds like you're a chassid, like you're someone extra special. So Rava doesn't really like this. I'm really Rava. The opposite of kadosh is not rasha, evil person, but someone who doesn't listen to the rabbis is an evil person. So if you say someone who listens to the rabbis is sanctified, but if you don't listen to the rabbis, you're just kind of average. Well, that's not true, right? You have to listen to the rabbis. If you don't listen to the rabbis, you're an evil person. So kadosh is not really the term you should use for someone who listens to the rabbis. So Rava says, Rava, kadesh atzmecha b'mutar lecha. What do the rabbis do when they make these decrees? They make the decrees in order that, right, kadesh atzmecha, sanctify yourself b'mutar lecha. In other words, the Torah says this is forbidden, and you should also forbid this, right? Go forbid more so that you don't come to accidentally go against Torah law. And that's what we call sanctify yourself, okay? So because it says sanctify yourself b'mutar lecha, or because that's a law that we believe in, right? That's what the rabbis are doing when they do this. So that's why rabbinic law is called Isurei Kedusha, because there are ways of, right? The whole reason we're going to see who all these shniot are, and the reason they said you can't sleep with these people are because we're worried if we allow that, you might allow a closer relative. So we now had two different versions of what Isur Mitzvah and what Isur Kedusha is. Now, even though we're still on Amud Aleph, we're now going to start a sugya, which is going to basically take us till the end of the daf today. Almanah Kohen Gadol. So now we're going to focus on this Almanah Kohen Gadol case and the whole last part of the Mishnah, which is basically saying, in this case, where it's an Isur Lav, what are we going to say? You can't do Yibum, right? You can only do Chalitza, but you can't do Yibum, okay? You're not allowed to marry because it's Isur Lav. We don't, Gemara's going to have a big question with this. First, they're going to infer something from the Mishnah. In general, Yibum is, you perform Yibum if a man was married to a woman, dies childless. But not only if he was married, if he was halachically engaged. Again, halachically engaged, you always have to remember, is not our engagement today. If a couple gets engaged, they don't need a get if they break their engagement. Okay, we know that to be the case. But in those days, they used to do erusin in a different way. What we do under the chuppah, they would do often a year before. And if you want to break the erusin, you need a get. If you die childless from the erusin, the woman needs to do chalitza or yibum. So the Gemara says, kapasik v'tani. The Mishnah didn't specify, are we talking about from marriage or from engagement? Therefore, we're going to assume lo shnam min nisuin v'lo shnam min erusin. Shouldn't matter whether it's marriage or divorce or engagement. So bishlam min nisuin. I get in nisuin why you can't do yibum, because now we're going back to a sugya we learned in the beginning of the Masechet. We've spent a long time on nisuin aseh v'lo taseh. Right, yibum is a mitzvah aseh. But not marrying an almana, and a kohen gadol can't marry an almana for two reasons. There's a mitzvah aseh associated with it, a positive and a negative. What is it? So the negative commandment is you can't marry an almana. It says it in the Torah. You can't marry a woman who's a widow. But it also says in the Torah, isha bivtu leha yikach. You have to marry specifically a woman who's a virgin. That's a special halacha for a kohen gadol. Now, obviously, an almana is generally not a virgin because she's been married to someone. However, if she's engaged, then she is still a betula, okay? Because engagement doesn't permit you to have relations. So therefore, we're going to say like this. When they're married, I understand. Aseh v'lo taseh, right? The commandment not to marry an almana is both a positive and a negative, in which case, ein aseh doche lo taseh v'aseh. You can't have the positive commandment of yibum override an aseh and a lo taseh. But remember what we learned. An aseh can override a lo taseh, unless it's karet. This isn't karet. So elam in erusin lo taseh greidahu yavo aseh v'yitcha lo taseh. It's just a lo taseh. Then the aseh should override the lo taseh. Okay, that's the Gemara's question, and that's a big question that we're going to have 5 answers to. Some of the answers are going to say they're going to split into 2 categories. Some are going to say there's a special drasha midoraita that's going to basically say by Torah law there's no yibum for this kind of relationship. It doesn't override because of some special something in the Torah. And some are going to say on a Torah level it works. It's just a rabbinic decree. Okay, and the rabbis forbade it for some particular reason. So we're going to start with that it's Torah. Amar Rav Gidal Amarav Amar Chav V'alta yivimto hasha'ava. This is the pasuk with Chaks Chalitza, and it says, "Im lo yachpotz haish lakachet et yivimto." If he doesn't want to take her as a wife, v'alta yivimto hasha'ara, then the Yevamot goes to the gate where the court sits, and etc. The word yivimto is repeated twice here. If he doesn't want to take his yivimto, then v'alta yivimto hasha'ara. It could have just said v'alta hasha'ara. You would know exactly who we're talking about. We just mentioned her a second ago. So they're going to say, she'ein Talmud lomar yivimto. That's an unnecessary word. Ma Talmud lomar yivimto is to say, yesh l'cha yivama achat she'ola l'chalitza ve'ona ala l'yibum. There's one type of yivama. There's one exception to the rule. That's normally, im lo yachpotz means, if she doesn't want to do yibum, you do chalitza, meaning chalitza is only when there's a potential to do yibum. But there's one exception where there is no potential to do yibum, and yet we do chalitza. And what's that? That's our case. Okay, so it's what we call almost a gzerat hakatuv. It comes from the Torah. It's just, a drasha, you have to just take it. Okay, that's anyone who's forbidden only by a lo taseh, so we make them do chalitza. So now they question and they say, and once you're going to say there's a pasuk that includes, maybe it should include even people who are forbidden karet, and maybe we should undo everything we learned in the last 20 dapim or 18 dapim and say, if it's karet, we make you do chalitza. So, Amar Kra, im lo yachpotz haish lakachet, hachafetz miyabem, just like we saw before. There was one pasuk which went one way, one pasuk that went the other way. Well, it says, if you don't want to marry her, do yibum, then you do chalitza, which seems to imply, right? Only hachafetz miyabem, if you wanted to, you could. So, kol oleh liyibum oleh lechalitza, v'kol she'ein oleh liyibum ein oleh lechalitza. You have to be potentially in the world of yibum to be able to do chalitza, other than obviously this one exception that we just said. But so ihachi chayvei lavim nami. So they say, wait, if you're going to say this is the principle, then the principle should exclude chayvei lavim. So they say harabe yivimto. In other words, we have 2 things pulling. One is saying only when you can do yibum can you do chalitza, and the other one saying, well, yivimto includes some additional case. So we're going to include chayvei lavim. So the Gemara is obviously going to ask, like we were asked earlier, similar structure. Umara'ita. Why include chayvei lavim and not chayvei krutu? Maybe it's to include everything, and that all these things that we've been learning all along, maybe they need chalitza to get out of it. which actually is somewhat logical, right? In fact, someone asked it after class one day, saying, well, why don't you just make them do chalitza, right? What's the big deal? I mean, even though chalitza is a bit of a big deal, but so now they say, turning on to Amud Bet now, mistabra chayve lavim tafsibu kiddushin, chayve kritu lo tafsibu kiddushin. This was all learned out from the words ulekacha lo liisha, right? In other words, it says that. Sorry, lo yachpot haish lakachat et yevimto. He doesn't want to marry. That means there has to be some potential marriage in there. When it's karet, and a woman, let's say the man decides to marry a woman who's forbidden by karet, there's no marriage. Even if he marries her and he says, Hareya mikudeshet li, and he does everything right, it's as if there's no marriage because it's so forbidden. But chayve lavim, if you marry a woman anyway, against the law, the marriage is valid. So therefore, since we're learning it from this verse that talks about if you don't want to marry her, there has to be some potential to marry her, actually. So therefore, it must be chayve kritu are on the outs and chayve lavim are on the ins, which again teaches us if it's only chayve lavim, then it's you would do chalitza. So far, we're okay with this answer. However, Rav is going to question this and say the following. What this basically means, and I want this to be very clear, this is going to raise a question. If you say it's a law midoraita, what you're basically saying is, by Torah law, there's absolutely no potential for yibum for a chayve lavim, but there is potential for chalitza. It's this one exception, right? Where there's no yibum on a Torah level, but there is chalitza on a Torah level. It's this unique exception from this drasha of yivimta. So Mativ Rava, wait a minute. Rava says, here's a bright. Isur mitzvah, isur kedusha, okay, which isur kedusha is what we were talking about, or isur mitzvah, depending on whether you're Rabbi Yehuda or the rabbis, but they're both included here. Ba aleha o chalatzla nifterat tzarata. Now, if she has a tzara, right, let's say the woman has a tzara. Now, the tzara is an isur lav to the person, let's say. So, if ba aleha o chalatzla nifterat tzarata, if he ends up doing yibum with her, or he does chalitza with her, the tzara is exempt. Now, that shows that yibum has validity on a Torah level. And we just said there is no such thing as yibum. So if you were to do it against the law, it shouldn't work at all. And this is saying it's actually effective. So that basically knocks out the opinion that on a Torah level, there is no yibum because there is chalitza, but there is no yibum. Because then if you did it, yibum shouldn't work at all. So, if you want to say this drasha is telling you, this is a case that has no place in the realm of yibum, but yet has chalitza, well, then it shouldn't work. Shouldn't work. So, Rav brought this question, but he himself is going to answer it. You could potentially read this Braita as litzdadin katani. You could split it into two. It talked about Isur Mitzvah and it talked about Isur Kedusha. Isur Mitzvah was Arayot Rabbanan, and Isur Kedusha is Isur Lav. So you could say, Ba'aleha, if he actually does Yibum with her, that's relating to the Isur Mitzvah, because there on a Torah level, you can marry her. It's only rabbinic level, it's forbidden. So then the Yibum will work. But Chalatzla is a Isur Kedusha. On our case, Yisur Lavim, it would only be if Chalatzla, it would exempt her tzara, but not if you did Yibum. So that's one way to resolve it. The problem is the next source is not going to be able to be explained that way because the next source is only going to be talking about Chayve Lavim. Mativ Rav. P'tsuat hakal krut. This is someone who has either crushed testicles or his penis is severed, some sort of problem, and a Sri Saddam, which is a human castrated the person. Vahazaken, these are all people who can't have children anymore. Zaken, we're talking about someone who is incapable of having children at this point. O chotzim o miyabnim. So they can either do chalitza or yibum, even though they can't really have children, right? But they can do either chalitza or yibum. So ketzad, how would this work? Because you're not allowed now. Pitzua dakana kutchukha are not allowed to marry. Okay, there's an isur lav about them. So let's try to figure this out. Meitu v'lahem achim v'lahem nashim. If these people died and they had brothers, or they had and wives, v'amdu achim v'asu ma'amar b'neshotehen, and they did ma'amar v'natnu get b'chatzu masha asu asu. If they did ma'amar, planned to marry them, and then they gave them a get, and then they did chalitza, it works. V'im ba'alu kanu, and if they were to have relations with them, it would have worked. Meitu achim v'amdu hem. This is more relevant for us. If the brothers died, and then they were left to do. The wives were left to do yibum or chalitza with these people that are asur to marry them. Okay, again, this is a little different from the zaken, who's not actually asur, but let's say the p'tsuat dakan kruchupcha that are forbidden. Va'asu ma'amar b'neshoteim. Okay, so this kruchuvcha p'tua daka does ma'amar with the woman. V'natnu gero shechatzu, ma sha'asu asu. Okay, so if they then give a get and they do chalitza, it would work. Or ve'im ba'alu kanu. And if they have relations with them, it would work. What do you see here? Isur lav, yibum is effective. Even though you're not allowed to, it's effective. And there's an additional thing, which is asur l'kaiman. Let's say you did yibum, had one act of sexual relations, you would have to divorce them immediately because it says, Mishum shenemar, lo yavo p'tua daka. He can't come b'kal Hashem. He can't marry a regular person in the community. Again, I'm not going to get into this whole topic. We'll deal with this when we get into it more head on. It's not really the main topic of our daf today. But there's no place for yibum here. And that's basically anytime we're going to give an answer that this is on a doraita level, we're going to have a problem with this source because it clearly says if you do it anyway, it's effective. And if the whole idea is that on a Torah level there is no yibum and yet there's chalitza, it shouldn't be effective if you did yibum. So that was all the first answer and Rava's rejection of the first answer. He tried to reject it from some other source. He answered, but this source is very clear. Chayve lavim work for yibum on a Torah level, which would be a problem. So Ela Amarav, Rava says, Al manamina erusin nami aseh v'lo taseh. First answer is to say, well, you said it's an aseh and a lo taseh, right? And the aseh should override the lo taseh. But there's also a mitzvah aseh, even in almanah from the erusin. It's not that he has to marry a virgin, it's something else. Dichtiv kedoshim yihyu Elohim. It says in the verses about the Kohanim, you have to be sanctified. Sanctified means marry the correct people. So therefore, there would be a positive and a negative, and that's why the mitzvah of yibum doesn't override. To which the Gemara asks, but what about a mamzer and a netina? That all works with the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hadyod and all that, but it doesn't help you with the mamzer and the netina. There's only a mitzvah lo taseh. So this is, by the way, in our parsha that we just read yesterday, Parshat Shmini, and it's actually not in the context of mamzer and netina. If you're wondering where were mamzer and netina in the parsha yesterday, it wasn't. It's in the section about the shratzim and the creatures that you can't eat in the yortamei and all that, and about the kosher food and all that. It says v'hitkadashtem. So they say that pasuk is giving you a mitzvah aseh to sanctify yourself and not do lo taseh. Basically means there we get an aseh and a lo taseh. So anyone who marries a mamzer also goes against that. And that's why the mitzvah aseh of yibum can't override an aseh and a lo taseh, to which the Gemara has a great question. Hitkadashtem means sanctify yourself and do mitzvot, all mitzvot. That means any mitzvah lo taseh also has an aseh, which means you'll never have this principle of aseh override lo taseh, which means we could have erased a bunch of the dafim in the beginning of this Masechet, which basically tried to prove that rule. So that can't possibly be. That's not a good answer. So Ela Amarava, attempt number 3 for an answer. Gzera, now he moves out of the realm of Torah law. It's a gzera. Rabbinic ordinance. Almanah mina erusim ata almanah mina nisuin. We won't let an almanah from erusim because if we allow an almanah from erusim, we'll marry a kohen gadol. We'll think that almanah from a marriage can also. So again, the Gemara is going to ask, what about a mamzer and a netina? What are we worried about? If we allow a mamzer and a netina to marry when there's a mitzvah involved, people might think you can marry them when there's not a mitzvah involved. So now they're going to start asking a whole slew of questions that are absurd. Well, then, we shouldn't allow yibum at all from the brother, from the father, because you can't do yibum with your brother through your mother. If you only share a mother, there's no yibum. And then it's just a regular eshet ach, erva. So if we're going to allow eshet ach from the father, maybe we should never allow yibum because people might think you can marry your brother through your mother. So they say, no one's going to confuse that because yibum b'nachal atalya, Rahmana. Yibum is all connected to who you inherits you. We learned that already. And therefore, everybody knows it only goes through the father. Isha she'en labanim lo tityabem. We shouldn't allow yibum with a woman who doesn't have kids, right? Whose husband doesn't have kids, because yibum's not allowed in a case when the woman does have kids. So maybe you'll think that yibum's allowed when she does have kids. So bibanim talya Rahmana me'ediata. Everyone knows yibum's only because he doesn't have kids. No one's going to confuse that. You shouldn't ever be allowed to do yibum with a brother, even though he was alive at the time, because you might think you might think maybe you could do yibum with a brother that wasn't alive at the time. So they're basically saying if you're worried about that, right, we could worry about a million things. No, I say that also now. Everybody knows that it's ki yishvu achim yachdav, and it's brothers that were living together, right? Even though you might think that one's less known. Maybe you'll say, don't ever let a woman do yibum because an Ilonit can't do yibum, so let's not let any women. To which the Gemara answers, lo shlicha. That's a very rare case. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Mamzerim initim lo shlicha. How common are mamzerim initim? Not the most common thing. So basically throws this one out the window because we shouldn't make a gzera for rare cases. So Elama Rava gzera bi'a rishona atu bi'a shniya. We're worried about the first bi'a atu the second bi'a. Remember what we said. And they're going to bring a bride to prove it. If you did it, you did it, and it works, but you can't stay married to them. So if we say it's effective the first, right, we allow it for the first one, people are going to think that you can stay married, and we don't want that. That's a good gzera. But Hadran, Rava actually rejects his own answer. V'itema Rav Ashi, lav milti da'amre da'amar Rish Lakish. I have a better answer. Rish Lakish says, Kol makom shata motzei aseh lo ta'aseh, im ata yachol lekayem shnehem mutav ve'im lav yavo aseh v'yitcha lo ta'aseh. You only allow the aseh to override the lo ta'aseh if we have no other choice. We have a great choice here. You could just do chalitza and still fulfill the mitzvah. So that's why we don't allow this. And that's a much better answer. Hachanami afshar b'chalitza d'mekayem aseh v'lo ta'aseh. What's the problem with this? But then that means, again, there's no yibum, there is chalitza, there's no yibum by Torah law. If there's no yibum by Torah law, why did that source say if you did yibum anyway, it works? So the commentaries claim that we go back to answer number 4, which is gazru bi'a rishona atu bi'a shniya. So those were our 5 answers that we saw. We're going to continue a little bit. I think the next stuff connects a little bit more, with this topic. That's it for today. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.